A phone rings inside a record company office in Cologne, and the voice on the other end is shaking. Stores across Britain are pulling an album off their shelves right now, this very afternoon. Reporters are calling it obscene. Lawyers are asking questions nobody wants to answer. And somewhere in Germany, 4 young rock musicians who thought they were about to release the biggest record of their lives are about to learn that their own album cover has just lit a fuse that could destroy everything they built, before a single new fan ever gets the chance to hear the music inside it. This is the story of how Scorpions almost lost their own record in a firestorm they never saw coming, and the secret scramble it took to save it. Rewind to the winter of 1975, sliding into 1976. Scorpions were not yet the arena-filling, world-conquering band that would one day command entire stadiums with anthems like "Rock You Like a Hurricane." They were something rawer, hungrier, still clawing their way up out of the smoky clubs of Hannover, still counting every Deutsche Mark of the recording budget. Klaus Meine's voice was already unmistakable, soaring and aching in the same breath, a sound that could fill a small room like it was a concert hall. Rudolf Schenker drove the band with iron discipline, the man who had founded Scorpions years earlier and refused, through every setback, to let it die. Uli John Roth, their virtuoso guitarist, brought a hypnotic, almost classical fire to the songs, something closer to Hendrix, filtered through a European dream of strange scales and long, searching solos. Francis Buchholz anchored the bottom end, and Rudy Lenners kept the rhythm locked tight behind them. They had already released In Trance and Fly to the Rainbow, 2 records that built them a devoted following at home in Germany, but had not yet made the rest of the world sit up and listen. Producer Dieter Dierks, the man who would shape the Scorpions' sound for the next 2 decades, brought them into his studio outside Cologne in the early months of 1976, with one goal burning through every long session that stretched into the night. This next album had to break them out. It had to be the one that finally made the whole world notice. The record that emerged from those long nights in the studio was fierce, moody, and unlike anything the band had made before, full of tension and shadow. They called it Virgin Killer. The title itself was meant as a dark metaphor, a bitter comment on the way the music industry could seduce young talent with promises of fame and then chew it up and discard it once the profit ran dry. The way innocence gets destroyed by ambition and greed. Klaus Meine has said in later years that the phrase was never meant literally, not for 1 second. It was symbolic, almost poetic in its bitterness, born from watching the business swallow young artists whole and spit them back out unrecognizable. Rudolf Schenker believed the songs themselves were some of the strongest the band had ever written, and everyone crowded into that studio control room, listening back through the speakers late at night, felt they were sitting on something special, something that could finally travel beyond Germany's borders. Nobody, at that stage, was thinking about the cover. That decision belonged to the label and its marketing team, not to the musicians who had poured months of their lives into the songs, and it was about to become the single most consequential choice of the band's entire career, one none of them could take back once it was made. When the finished artwork came back to the band, there was a long, uneasy silence in the room. The image chosen for the cover showed a young girl, a child, posed in a staged photograph built around the idea of shattered glass and broken innocence, a visual echo of the album's title and its bitter theme about the music business. It was intended, according to the label and the photographer hired for the shoot, as shock art, a provocation in the tradition of the era's most confrontational album sleeves, the kind of image designed to stop a browsing record buyer cold in a shop aisle. But even inside the band, several members felt an immediate, uncomfortable unease looking at the printed proofs laid out on the table. This had not been their creative decision. It had been handed to them as a finished concept from people higher up the chain of the label. And now their name, their music, 4 years of struggle and every song on the record were about to be stapled to a single photograph that would define how much of the world first saw them. Klaus Meine later admitted the cover was a mistake, one the band did not fully choose and would spend years afterward explaining and defending. But in early 1976, the record was already pressed, the sleeves already printed by the thousands. The die was cast, and there was no calling any of it back. At home in Germany, the reaction was almost eerily calm. German media and record buyers in the mid-1970s had a different relationship with confrontational art and nudity than audiences in other countries, shaped by a different cultural and legal history around explicit imagery in galleries, film, and print. Virgin Killer went on sale on the Brain and RCA labels without the uproar anyone might have quietly feared. Fans bought it in record numbers. Radio stations played it without hesitation. The songs themselves, tracks like Pictured Life and the ferocious title cut, started climbing in reputation among hard rock listeners hungry for something heavier and darker than what the mainstream charts were offering that year. For a brief, fragile window, it looked like Scorpions had actually pulled it off. The album that was supposed to break them internationally seemed to be doing exactly that, quietly building momentum, crossing borders in shipping crates, landing in import bins in London record shops and mail-order catalogs bound for fans across Europe who had never heard the band's name before. Nobody in the Scorpions camp yet understood that the very image they hoped would shock people into paying attention was about to shock an entire nation for reasons far more serious and far more dangerous to the band's future than anyone around that studio table had ever imagined. Then Virgin Killer crossed the English Channel, and everything changed overnight. Britain in the mid-1970s was a country with its own strict, deeply serious laws protecting children from exploitation, and a tabloid press eager to expose anything that crossed that line without mercy. When copies of the album began appearing on shelves in British import shops, word of the cover spread fast, and it spread with outrage riding right behind it. Retailers who had proudly displayed the striking sleeve in their front windows suddenly found themselves at the center of furious complaints from customers and parents alike. Newspapers picked up the story within days, and it was no longer being discussed anywhere as edgy rock and roll art pushing boundaries. It was being discussed in print as a potential crime. Distributors panicked and pulled their orders. Store managers yanked stock from the shelves without waiting for instructions from head office, hiding sleeves in back rooms. Within a matter of days, what had been a promising European rollout for Scorpions had curdled into a live legal and public relations emergency, one that threatened not just this one album's chances, but the band's entire reputation. Right at the exact moment they were finally trying to establish themselves outside Germany for the very first time. Back at the label, phones would not stop ringing, day and night. Executives at RCA's British operation were suddenly facing hard questions from company lawyers about whether simply having the album sitting in a warehouse constituted an offense under child protection law. For Scorpions, thousands of miles away and still touring German clubs and halls to support a record they were genuinely proud of musically, the news arriving from England felt like watching a fire spread through a building they were standing inside, helpless to reach the exits. Klaus Meine and Rudolf Schenker had built this band for nearly a decade, clawing their way up from small German clubs, surviving lineup changes and lean, hungry years, and now a single photograph they had not even chosen threatened to erase all of it in the eyes of an international audience before that audience had even heard a single note of the music. Management scrambled around the clock to understand the scale of the exposure. Was the album going to be banned outright across the entire country? Would there be criminal liability for anyone connected to its distribution, down the chain to the shop clerks themselves? Could the band's name survive being associated, however unfairly, with an image now being described in print as exploitative? There were urgent, tense phone calls between the label's German and British offices late into the night, lawyers weighing in from every side, and a growing, sickening recognition that waiting any longer was not an option. Something had to be decided, and it had to be decided immediately. The solution that finally emerged was as pragmatic as it was quiet, decided in a matter of days under enormous pressure. Rather than fight a losing battle in the press over the original artwork, RCA moved fast to replace the cover entirely in every market where the backlash was fiercest. The new sleeve was almost defiantly ordinary by comparison, a simple, safe photograph of the four band members standing together in leather and denim. No shattered glass, no shock concept, just scorpions as themselves, looking straight into the camera. Original copies were pulled from shelves and quietly withdrawn wherever distributors could still reach them, replaced by the safer image before any further damage could spread through the press. It was damage control executed under real, immediate pressure, a scramble to protect not just the sales figures on a spreadsheet, but the very survival of the band's international reputation at the exact moment they most desperately needed the world's trust. In the United States, the album would eventually appear only with this replacement cover, and an entire generation of American fans who fell in love with Virgin Killer's music never even knew the original image had existed at all. Not until years later, when the story slowly resurfaced in music press retrospectives and long magazine features about the band's early, turbulent years. The tension did not disappear overnight, not even close. For months afterward, the band lived with the constant uncertainty of not knowing how far the controversy might reach, whether it would follow them onto foreign stages, into interviews, into the private minds of promoters quietly deciding whether booking Scorpions was worth the risk. Klaus Meine has spoken candidly in later interviews about how uncomfortable that entire period truly was, insisting again and again that neither he nor his bandmates had chosen or designed the cover themselves, and that the band bore the full public consequences for a decision made by people above their heads in an office they had never even visited. It was a hard, bitter lesson learned early in their career about how little control young artists sometimes have over the images wrapped around their own work, and about how one single choice made in a boardroom could threaten years of effort built one small club at a time, night after night, city after city, town after town. Yet through all of it, Scorpions kept working. They toured. They wrote new songs. They refused, stubbornly, to let the scandal define them or slow them down, channeling that same iron discipline that had carried Rudolf Schenker's band from the basements of Hannover to international stages in the first place. What followed in the years afterward proved that the music itself could outlast the storm. Scorpions pressed forward into Taken by Force in 1977, then weathered a major lineup shakeup when Uli John Roth chose to leave the band to pursue his own musical direction, bringing Michael Schenker briefly back into the fold before Matthias Jabs finally took the lead guitar chair for good, a seat he still holds today. By 1979, Love Drive arrived, and the band's true international breakthrough finally came, not through shock imagery or manufactured controversy, but through songs so strong that radio programmers and audiences across the world simply could not resist them. The nightmare of Virgin Killer's release slowly transformed over years of touring and hit records into something else entirely, a cautionary chapter in the band's origin story rather than a permanent stain on their name. Proof that Scorpions could survive a crisis that might have quietly ended a lesser band before it ever truly began its climb toward the arenas of the world. But the story never fully closed, not even decades later. In 2008, the controversy resurfaced in a way absolutely nobody could have predicted. Britain's Internet Watch Foundation flagged the original Virgin Killer cover image hosted on a Wikipedia page, and for several tense days, access to that page and related Wikipedia content was restricted for millions of British Internet users, reigniting a fierce public debate that had first erupted more than 30 years earlier and never fully died. Legal authorities ultimately determined no prosecution was warranted, since the image had been legally produced and distributed decades before as a controversial, if deeply misguided, artistic choice back in 1976. Still, the episode proved that some fires never fully burn out, that they simply wait for the right spark to flare again. Today, Virgin Killer stands as one of the most notorious album covers in all of rock history. A cautionary tale still taught and discussed in conversations about censorship, artistic responsibility, and the reckless choices sometimes made in the name of shock value and quick attention. For Klaus, Meine, Rudolf Schenker, and the rest of Scorpions, it remains a chapter they never truly asked for and could not fully control, but one that, against every early sign of disaster, they survived, turning near catastrophe into just one more hard test on the long, unlikely road to becoming true rock legends.